The recoil of the maneuvering thrusters shuddered through the hull of the wayward Ember, a vibration that Edward felt in his teeth rather than his bones. It was a sensation as familiar to him as the ache in his lower back or the smell of recycled coffee that permeated the cockpit. He did not need to look at the instrument panel to know that the landing gear had failed to lock on the first try. The hydraulic groan from the port side told him everything he needed to know. "Come on, you old bucket of bolts," Edward muttered, his fingers dancing across the haptic interface with a speed that belied his exhaustion. "Don't get temperamental with me now. We are just here for a drop and a hop." He toggled the manual override, forcing the strut down with a metallic clang that rang through the small freighter. The green light on the dashboard finally flickered into existence, steadying into a solid emerald glow. "Touchdown," Nova's voice chimed from the co-pilot seat. She was spun around her knees, pulled up to her chest, a stylus in one hand and a digital sketchpad balanced on her legs. Edward exhaled the tension in his shoulders, releasing just a fraction. He looked over at his daughter. At 10 years old, Nova was a chaotic storm of grease smudges and oversized flight suits. Currently, she was trying to capture the likeness of a dragon war mage she had seen on the news feeds, though in her version, the terrifying reptilian sorcerer was wearing a chef's hat and holding a whisk. "Touchdown," Edward agreed, unbuckling his harness. "Stay put while I check the seals. The atmosphere on Keros 4 is thinner than a miser's wallet. If the seals hold, we can go out. If not, we are breathing canned air until we leave." "Can we go to the market?" Nova asked, her eyes lighting up with that dangerous high-voltage curiosity that terrified him more than any anti-aircraft battery ever could. "Please, Dad. You promised we could look for new pigments." "I said maybe," Edward corrected, standing up and stretching. He was a tall man, lean and corded with the kind of muscle one built from hauling cargo crates rather than gym vanity. His face was a map of the Ember war lines, etched around his eyes from squinting into solar flares and watching friends vanish into the void. "Let me check the cargo manifest and the atmospheric density. Then we will see." He walked out of the cockpit and down the narrow corridor toward the cargo hold. The Wayward Ember was a courier-class interceptor from the war days, retrofitted badly for heavy freight. She was fast, ugly, and temperamental, but she was home. At the top of the ramp, leading down to the main airlock, Edward stopped. He reached into the pocket of his flight jacket and pulled out 3 nutrient bars. They were standard-issue tasteless blocks of protein and localized vitamins wrapped in silver foil, the kind of food that kept you alive, but made you wish you weren't. He knelt and placed them on the metal grating, right at the edge of the airlock door, lining them up perfectly parallel to one another. It was a ritual, a superstition, a ghost story, he told himself. During the Ember War, when he was running blockade lines to drop supplies to besieged colonies, being late meant people starved. Being late meant death. He had survived the war when better pilots had not, and the guilt sat in his gut like a swallowed stone. So wherever he landed, he left 3 bars. For the ghosts, for the stragglers, for anyone who arrived too late. For those who missed the boat, he whispered a habit he couldn't break. He straightened up, adjusted his jacket, and hit the cycle button. The ramp hissed, lowering slowly onto the cracked, parched concrete of the Keros 4 landing pad. The world outside was dying. That was the only way to describe it. Keros 4 had been a mining jewel before the war, but now the tectonic stabilizers were failing. The sky was a bruised shade of violet, streaked with thin, sickly clouds that offered no protection from the harsh starlight. The air smelled of sulfur, and ozone thin and sharp in the lungs. Edward checked his datapad. The bioglass shipment was ready. 12 crates of high-grade translucent silicate, used for greenhouse domes. It was fragile, heavy, and paid just enough to cover fuel, and maybe a week of real food. "Atmosphere is safe, but barely," Edward called out over the ship's comms. "Grab your breather mask just in case, Nova." And your coat. It is freezing out here. Nova bounded down the ramp a moment later, her sketchpad shoved into a satchel. She had pulled a heavy thermal poncho over her flight suit, making her look like a very small, very colorful tent. The market is that way, she pointed toward a cluster of pressurized domes and shanty structures clinging to the edge of the spaceport. Delivery first, Edward said, though he couldn't help but smile at her energy. Then market. Then we leave. This planet is shaking itself apart, Nova. I do not want to be here when the big one hits. The delivery was a headache, as all deliveries were. The warehouse foreman, a sour-faced human with a cybernetic eye that whirred distractingly, tried to haggle down the agreed price, claiming 2 of the crates had hairline fractures. Edward spent 40 minutes arguing physics and contract law, until he got paid the full amount minus a 5% processing fee that was blatant extortion. By the time they walked out of the warehouse, Edward's mood was foul, but Nova's enthusiasm was undimmed. "Come on, Dad, I smell spiced tea," she chirped, tugging on his sleeve. The central market of Keros 4 was a testament to the galaxy's stubborn refusal to give up. It was a sprawling, chaotic maze of stalls, set up under a massive flickering energy shield that held the atmosphere in. The crowd was a riot of biology. A towering dragon, his scales dull from the poor air quality, was selling salvaged ship armor, his tail sweeping back and forth to clear a path. A pair of vampires, their pale skin covered in protective UV weave cloaks, were haggling over synthetic blood packs with a bored-looking vendor. There were catfolk darting through the crowd, their movements fluid and silent, selling aromatic herbs and repairing tech scraps. And there were the arc scars. Edward tried not to look at them, but they were impossible to miss. Not physical scars on people, but scars on reality itself. In the distance beyond the market shield, the horizon seemed to shimmer and glitch, as if the universe was rendering poorly. A legacy of the weapons used in the war tiers in space-time that drove men mad if they stared too long. "Dad, look at that." Nova pulled him toward a stall, draped in heavy tapestries. Edward kept a hand on his sidearm, a heavy stun-pulse pistol concealed under his jacket, and followed. He scanned the crowd, his pilot's eyes tracking vectors and threats. The desperation here was palpable. Everyone was selling something, and everyone was looking for a ticket off-world. They wandered deeper into the market past the food stalls and the tech scavengers until the noise of the crowd changed. The haggling became quieter, the atmosphere heavier. The air here smelled less like spices and more like antiseptic and unwashed bodies. "Nova, let's head back," Edward said, his instincts flaring. "This isn't the place for pigments." "Wait, what are they?" Nova stopped, her eyes wide. They had drifted into the bonding pens. It was a polite name for a slave market. After the war, the Galactic Concord had technically outlawed slavery, but on the fringe worlds like Keros 4, legality was a suggestion, not a rule. They called it indentured bonding, or contracted guardianship. But Edward knew a cage when he saw one. In the center of the plaza, 3 energy cages hummed, with a low, menacing buzz. Inside them sat 3 figures. Wolfkin. They were tall, powerfully built with lupine ears, twitching atop human-like hair, and tails curled protectively around their legs. Their eyes were striking gold, amber, and silver, but currently they were dull with exhaustion and defeat. The first one, the one on the left, looked like a coiled spring. She had scars on her arms, and a look in her eyes that said she would bite the throat out of anyone who came too close, if only the shock collar around her neck didn't disable her. That was Jessie. The middle one was quieter, her eyes closed, as if she were meditating, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the dust of the cage floor. Mana. The third one was the youngest, looking barely older than a teenager in Wolfkin years. She was curled up, shivering despite the heat of the market, looking at the crowd with terrified wide eyes. Fanny, a handler, a greasy man with expensive boots and a smile that showed too many teeth, was tapping the energy bars with a stun baton. "Top of the line!" the handler shouted to a passing group of mercenaries. Wolfkin stock. Strong loyal, once broken, excellent for heavy gravity labor or personal security. The bonding codes are fresh. Buy one. Get the collar remote at 50% off. Edward felt bile rise in his throat. He hated this. He hated everything about it. But he was one man with a broken-down ship and barely enough credits to refuel. He couldn't save the galaxy. He had learned that the hard way when he was 22 and watching a refugee transport burn because he had been ordered to hold his position. "Dad," Nova whispered. Her voice was trembling. "Don't look, Nova," Edward said, his voice rough. "Let's go." "But they are people," she said, rooting her feet to the ground. "They are. It is complicated. Come on." He tugged her hand, but she pulled away. Before Edward could stop her, Nova stepped closer to the cages. She reached into her pocket. Edward's heart hammered against his ribs. If she caused a scene, if the handler got aggressive, Nova didn't scream. She didn't shout. She simply pulled out a nutrient bar, one Edward had given her for a snack earlier, and slid it through the narrow gap between the energy field emitters of the first cage. The field hissed, singing the fine hairs on her arm, but she didn't flinch. The bar landed with a soft thud in front of the fierce-looking Wolfkin, the one named Jesse. Jessie looked down at the foil-wrapped bar, then up at the human child. Her lip curled, anticipating a trick, a cruel joke. "It is peanut butter flavor," Nova whispered, leaning in as close as she dared. "It is not much. But I don't think you are a thing." The market noise seemed to drop away. Jessie froze. The aggression in her posture faltered, replaced by a sudden devastating confusion. She looked at the bar, then back at Nova, and for a second the amber fire in her eyes softened. It was the look of someone who had forgotten what kindness felt like, and was suddenly terrified by the memory of it. The handler noticed. He spun around, raising his baton. "Hey, get away from the merchandise, brat. You damage the goods you pay for them." Edward was there in a heartbeat. He didn't draw his weapon that would get them killed, but he stepped between the handler and Nova, his posture shifting from tired dad to combat veteran. "She is just a kid," Edward said, his voice low and dangerous. "She didn't know the rules. Back off." The handler sneered, looking Edward up and down, assessing the worn flight jacket and the lack of expensive jewelry. "Get her out of here, Spacer. Unless you are buying 3,000 credits for the set. A steal, considering the planet is falling apart." 3,000 credits. Edward had 4,000 in his account, and he needed 3,500 for fuel and the port fees to leave the system. "Not today," Edward said, grabbing Nova's shoulder. "We are leaving." He turned his back on the cages. It was the hardest thing he had done in years. He felt the gaze of the Wolfkin women boring into his back. He felt the weight of his own hypocrisy. He left nutrient bars on the ramp for ghosts, but walked away from the living. "I have to go back to the ship," he told himself. "I have to get Nova safe. I cannot save everyone." But as they walked away, the image of the middle Wolfkin mana flashed in his mind. She hadn't looked at the food. She had looked at him. And for a split second, Edward had felt a vibration in his skull, a hum that matched the frequency of the ship's hyperdrive engine. It was a sensation he hadn't felt since the war, when he used to navigate debris fields by feeling the gaps in space. He stopped. "Dad." Nova looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "We can't just leave them." Edward looked at the datapad in his hand. He brought up the ship's interface. Wayward Ember. Cargo hold capacity. Fuel consumption rates. He looked at the map of the spaceport. The warehouse where he had just delivered the bioglass was only 200 meters from the bonding pens. The loading dock for outbound freight was right behind it. The handler was distracted arguing with a dragon mercenary about the price of the youngest Wolfkin. Edward's chest tightened. The old wound, the memory of the burning refugee ship, throbbed. He looked at Nova. She wasn't drawing anymore. She was waiting for him to be the hero she thought he was. "Damn it," Edward whispered. "Damn it all to hell." He crouched down to Nova's level. Listen to me. Go back to the ship. Lock the hatch. Do not open it for anyone but me. Start the pre-flight sequence for the main thrusters. Dad, go, he said, his voice firm. He said his voice. I have to go talk to a man about some glass. Nova's eyes widened, realizing what he meant. She nodded furiously, wiped her eyes, and took off running toward the landing pads. Edward turned back toward the warehouse, but he didn't go to the front door. He went to the loading bay where a catfolk dock worker, the one he had noticed earlier eyeing his own packet of cigarettes, was taking a break. The catfolk, a lean male with ginger fur and a grease-stained vest, looked up as Edward approached. Shift is over, human, the catfolk spat. Not quite, Edward said, pulling out his datapad and transferring 500 credits to a blank chip. He held it up. I made a mistake with my delivery. I need to swap out 3 crates of bioglass. I have 3 special containers coming in from the bonding pens. They need to be labeled as fragile biological research material and loaded onto the Wayward Ember immediately. The catfolk's ears twitched. He looked at the credit chip, then at Edward. Bonding pen stock. That is heavy cargo. Lots of paperwork. Another 500 says the paperwork got lost in the system update, Edward said, his heart racing. That was 1,000 credits gone. He was eating into his fuel money. He would have to fly dangerously close to the gravity wells to slingshot out of the system if he wanted to save fuel. The catfolk grinned, showing sharp teeth. He snatched the chip. Bring them to Bay 4. You have 10 minutes before the supervisor comes back from his smoke break. Edward moved. He didn't go back to the handler. He went around the back of the cages to the power junction box. He wasn't a hacker, but he was a pilot, and he knew how energy flow worked. He pulled his multi-tool from his belt. He didn't disable the cages that would trigger an alarm. Instead, he bypassed the lock mechanism, tricking the system into thinking the containment field was still active, while creating a physical hole in the rear shielding. He slipped through the gap. The 3 Wolfkin women jumped, pressing themselves against the far side of the cage. Quiet, Edward hissed, holding up his hands. I am not buying. I am stealing. But you have to move now. Jessie stepped forward, her teeth bared. She looked ready to kill him. The girl, Edward said, meeting her eyes. The one with the drawing. She is my daughter. She thinks you are people. Don't make her a liar. Jessie paused. The memory of the peanut butter bar seemed to flash behind her eyes. She nodded once, sharp and military. She grabbed Fanny, who was shaking, and hauled her up. Mana stood gracefully, her eyes locking onto Edward with that same, unnerving intensity. Follow me. Keep your heads down. If anyone asks, you are moving equipment. The walk to Bay 4 was the longest 300 meters of Edward's life. Every siren, every shout from the market made him flinch. He threw a tarp over the 3 women, guiding them through the shadows of the shipping containers. They reached the loading bay. The catfolk was there, standing next to 3 large empty shipping crates designed for bioglass. They were reinforced, soundproof, and possessed air scrubbers. Get in, Edward ordered. In the box, Fanny whispered, her voice trembling. Like cargo. Like cargo that is leaving this rock, Edward said grimly. It is a 3-hour flight to the edge of the scan zone. Can you hold out? Jessie ushered her sisters in. Before she climbed into the last crate, she looked at Edward. Why? Because I had space in the hold, Edward lied. And I hate wasted space. He sealed the crates. The catfolk slapped a biohazard fragile sticker on the side and used a grav lifter to float them toward the Wayward Ember. Edward walked beside the floating crates, his hand resting on his pistol. They reached the ship's ramp. Nova was waiting at the top, the airlock cycle already prepped. Load them in the secure hold, Edward shouted over the rising wind. The atmosphere on Keros 4 was starting to turn into a gale as evening approached. As soon as the crates were magnetic locked to the deck, Edward hit the ramp controls. The metal door hissed shut, sealing out the sulfur smell and the dying world. Cockpit, now, Edward barked, running up the ladder. He threw himself into the pilot's seat. Strap in, Nova. "Are they okay?" Nova asked, buckling her harness with trembling hands. "They are on board. That is step 1. Step 2 is not getting shot down by planetary security for trafficking." Edward fired the main ignition. The wayward Ember roared, a beast waking up from a nap. The ship shuddered violently as it broke gravity. "Traffic control to Wayward Ember," the radio crackled. "You are departing ahead of schedule. We show a discrepancy in your loading weight. Hold position for a scan," Edward cursed. "Hold position, my eye." "Dad," Nova yelled. "I know." Edward flipped a bank of switches, dumping coolant into the exhaust. "It will scramble their thermal scans." He slammed the throttle forward. The ship lurched G-force, pressing them back into their seats. On the rear monitor, Keros 4 began to shrink, a cracked marble of brown and purple falling away into the darkness. The radio crackled with angry static, then faded. They were too fast. The old courier engine, built for blockade running, still had some kick in it. Edward watched the altitude meter climb. 10,000 feet. 20,000. Orbit. He didn't relax until the blue line of the atmosphere was a curve beneath them, and the stars were clear and sharp ahead. He engaged the sublight drive, setting a course for the nearest jump point. Silence settled over the cockpit, broken only by the hum of the reactor. Edward let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for an hour. He rubbed his face with his hands. He had just spent 25% of his total wealth to smuggle 3 undocumented aliens off a dying planet, risking his ship, his license, and his daughter's safety. He was an idiot. A complete and utter idiot. "You did it," Nova whispered, looking at him with awe. "Yeah," Edward said, his voice weary. "I did it. Now I just have to figure out how to feed them, where to take them, and how to explain to the galaxy why I am hauling 3 wolfkin in bioglass crates." He stood up, his knees popping. "Take the stick, Nova. Keep her steady on Vector 39. I am going to go let our guests out before they run out of air." As he walked back toward the cargo hold, Edward felt a strange sensation. The 3 nutrient bars he had left on the ramp at Keros 4 were gone, left behind on the landing pad for the ghosts. But for the first time in a long time, the ship didn't feel empty. It felt heavy. Not with cargo, but with consequence. He keyed the code into the cargo hold door. The wayward Ember drifted away from the dying planet, carrying its stolen life into the dark. The cargo hold was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the strips of emergency lighting running along the floor. The 3 crates sat in the center of the bay, humming softly from the internal life support units. Edward stood before them for a moment, the silence of the ship pressing in on him. He ran a hand through his hair, realizing his hands were shaking slightly. Adrenaline withdrawal. "Okay," he muttered to himself. "No turning back now." He approached the first crate, the one he knew contained Jessie, and punched the release sequence into the keypad. The maglocks disengaged with a heavy clunk. The lid hissed open pneumatic pistons, pushing it upward. For a second, nothing happened. Then a blur of motion. Jessie erupted from the crate, not with gratitude, but with the explosive speed of a cornered animal. She landed in a crouch on the deck plates, her eyes scanning the room, assessing threats, exits, and weapons in a single heartbeat. Her lips were pulled back, revealing canines that were definitely not human. "Easy," Edward said, raising his hands, palms open. "You are safe. We are in orbit." The second crate popped open. Mana sat up slowly, her movements fluid and calm. She took a deep breath, tasting the recycled air of the ship. She looked at Edward, then at the metal walls surrounding them. "Metal," Mana said softly. "Sky metal. We are flying." The third crate opened, and Fanny tumbled out, landing on her side with a groan. She scrambled to her feet, looking wildly between her sisters and the human pilot. "Are we dead?" Fanny asked, her voice high and panicked. "Did the bad man eat us?" "No one is eating anyone," Edward said, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "You are on the freighter Wayward Ember. I am Captain Edward. And you are free. Jessie finished the sentence, though she made it sound like a question. She stood up to her full height. She was taller than Edward by an inch, and her presence was intimidating. She wore the rags of the bonding pen, but she stood like she was wearing armor. "Free," Edward agreed. "Or as free as you can be while stuck on a tin can hurtling through the void." Jessie stepped closer to him. She sniffed the air near him, her nose wrinkling. "You smell like engine grease and anxiety." "That is my cologne," Edward deadpanned. "Look, I do not have a plan. I saw you in the cage. I saw my kid looking at you and I did something stupid. I do not have papers for you. I do not have much food. But I am not going to sell you." Mana climbed out of her crate and walked over to the viewport. She pressed her hand against the thick glass, looking out at the stars, streaking by as the ship accelerated. "The chains are gone," Mana whispered, touching her neck where the collar had been. Edward had disabled the remote link, but the physical collars were still there. "The silence is loud." "We need food," Fanny said, her stomach giving a traitorous growl that echoed in the quiet hold. "And not peanut butter bars," Edward sighed. "I might have some rehydrated noodles in the galley. But first we need to get those collars off. I have a toolkit in the—" "I can do it," Fanny said, stepping forward. She looked at the control mechanism on Jessie's collar. "Give me a microdriver and a kinetic bypass. I fixed the water pumps in the pens. I can fix this," Edward blinked. He looked at the youngest wolfkin who was currently wiping soot off her nose. "You are a mechanic." "I am good with my hands," Fanny shrugged. "Okay," Edward said. "Tools are in the locker on the left. Galley is up the ladder. Do not touch the red buttons on the bridge. Just give me a minute." He watched them for a moment longer. 3 strangers, 3 aliens, 3 fugitives. He had just complicated his life by a factor of 1,000%. He turned and walked back toward the cockpit where Nova was waiting. As he climbed the ladder, he heard Fanny ask, "Does he have any meat I would kill for a steak?" "He saved us, Fanny," Jessie's voice was low stern. "Do not ask for steak. We eat what he gives us. We survive." "For now," Mana added darkly. Edward paused on the ladder, a wry smile touching his lips. He had traded 3 nutrient bars for 3 wolfkin. It was the worst trade deal in the history of the galaxy. But as the wayward ember punched into the dark, leaving the dying world of Keros 4 behind, Edward felt a strange sense of lightness. The ghosts at the airlock were gone. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was driving. "Dad," Nova called from the cockpit. "The nav computer is asking for a destination." Edward climbed into the pilot's seat. He looked at the star map. "Set a course for Concord Hub," Edward said. "It is a long way, but the laws are clearer there." And Nova. "Yeah, good job with the nutrient bar," Nova beamed. The stars stretched out into lines of light as the hyperdrive engaged, swallowing the ship and its strange newfound family into the belly of the galaxy. The rear monitors of the wayward ember displayed a shrinking sphere of bruised violet and sickly brown. Keros 4, a planet that had seen better centuries, was receding into the void, looking more like a festering wound than a celestial body. The wayward ember shuddered as its sublight engines pushed past the gravitational threshold, the metal hull groaning under the strain of a rapid ascent. Edward sat in the pilot's seat, his hands gripping the yoke tightly enough to turn his knuckles white. His heart was still hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a physical reminder of the madness he had just committed. He checked the proximity sensors for the 3rd time in 10 seconds. The screen remained clear of pursuit vectors, but the silence of space felt heavy, accusatory. "We are clear of the patrol zone," Nova said from the co-pilot seat. Her voice was small, lacking its usual boundless energy. She was staring at the comms panel, watching the signal strength of the planet fade to static. "Good," Edward exhaled, forcing his fingers to uncurl from the controls. "Keep an eye on the thermal scopes. If anyone is following us, they will have to burn hard to catch up." He unbuckled his harness, the straps retracting with a sharp snap. The adrenaline was beginning to curdle into a cold, hard knot of anxiety in his stomach. He had just smuggled 3 undocumented biological assets, people he corrected himself immediately, off a regulated market world. He was a courier, a cargo hauler, a single father. He was not a revolutionary. "Come on," Edward said, standing up and smoothing down his flight jacket. "Let us go see what we actually bought with our fuel money." Nova scrambled out of her seat, her boots clumping loudly on the metal deck. She followed him down the narrow corridor that connected the cockpit to the main cargo hold. The ship hummed around them, a familiar vibration that usually brought Edward comfort. Today, it felt like the ticking of a bomb. The cargo hold was frigid. The climate control was set to preserve bioglass, not passengers. The 3 reinforced crates sat in the center of the bay, secured by magnetic locks. They vibrated slightly, resonating with the ship's engine pitch. Edward approached the control panel on the wall. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering over the release key. He was about to let 3 apex predators out of a box in a confined space. "Stand behind me, Nova," Edward murmured. "They are not dangerous, Dad," Nova insisted, though she stepped behind his leg anyway. "They were sad." "Sad things can be dangerous when they are cornered," Edward replied. He hit the release sequence. The hydraulic seals on the crates hissed, venting pressurized gas. The lids popped open in unison. The reaction was instantaneous. From the leftmost crate, Jessie erupted like a coil of steel snapping loose. She did not stumble or stretch. She vaulted out, landing in a low crouch on the deck plates. Her eyes, burning with a fierce amber light, swept the room, cataloging exits, weapons, and cover in a single heartbeat. Her lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were definitely designed for tearing, and a low, rumbling growl vibrated in her throat. From the middle crate, Mana rose with a fluid, eerie grace. She did not jump. She simply sat up and stepped out, her movements silent. She ignored Edward and Nova entirely, instead tilting her head back to look at the ceiling, her nostrils flaring as she sampled the recycled air, tasting the metallic tang of the ship's atmosphere. The 3rd crate rattled. A hand scrabbled at the edge, slipping once before gripping tight. Fanny hauled herself up, looking disheveled and slightly green. She tumbled over the edge and landed on her hands and knees, coughing. "By the moons," Fanny wheezed, rolling onto her back and staring up at the cargo bay lights. "I thought we were going to be in there forever. My tail is asleep. I cannot feel my tail." "Is that normal?" The tension in the room, which had been pulled taut enough to snap, suddenly slackened. Fanny sat up, rubbing her lower back. She looked at Edward, then at Nova, and her expression brightened. "Hey, it is the food girl." She looked at Edward. "And the driver. Do you have any more of those bars? Or actual food? I would eat a boot right now if it was seasoned properly." Nova giggled, the sound echoing strangely in the metallic bay. Jessie did not laugh. She straightened up, moving in front of her sisters. Her posture was protective, her shoulders squared. She wore the ragged gray tunic of the bonding pens, but she wore it like battle armor. "Where are we?" Jessie demanded. Her voice was rasping, unused to speaking freely. "Orbit," Edward said, keeping his hands visible and away from the stun pistol holstered at his hip. "Leaving the Keros system. You are safe." "Safe," Jessie repeated the word, as if it were a foreign concept she could not quite translate. She looked around the cargo hold, taking in the scuffed bulkheads, the loose netting, and the flickering light strip. "This is a hauler, a human ship." "The Wayward Ember," Edward introduced. "I am Edward. This is Nova. We are the ones who took you out of the crates." Mana stepped forward then. She was slightly shorter than Jessie, with fur that held a silver sheen compared to Jessie's dark timber wolf coloring. She walked right up to Edward, ignoring his personal space, and stared into his eyes. Her gaze was unsettling, like she was looking at the back of his skull. "Why?" Mana asked. It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of an interrogation. Edward shifted his weight, uncomfortable under the scrutiny. Because my daughter asked me to, and because I had empty space in the hold. I hate flying with an empty hold. It is bad luck. It was a lie, and a poor one. Mana tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she did not call him out on it. We are hungry, Fanny said, standing up and dusting herself off. She wobbled slightly, the ship's artificial gravity, clearly different from what she was used to. And thirsty. And I think I smell engine coolant, which is giving me a headache. Galley is this way, Edward sighed, gesturing toward the ladder. I do not have a 5-star menu. We have rehydrated noodles, protein paste, and maybe some dried fruit if Nova has not eaten it all. I saved the mangoes, Nova chirped. Come on, I will show you. Nova grabbed Fanny's hand. For a second, Edward flinched, expecting the wolfkin to recoil. But Fanny just looked surprised, then squeezed the small human hand back. Lead the way, little scout, Fanny smiled. As they climbed the ladder, Jessie hung back, her eyes locked on Edward. She waited until the others were out of earshot. You bought us, she said. It was not a question. I stole you, Edward corrected. I paid a bribe to get you loaded, but I did not pay the slaver. There is a difference. Is there? Jessie challenged. You moved us from one cage to another. What do you expect in return? Labor protection. Something else. Edward met her gaze. He saw the trauma there, layers of betrayal hardened into a diamond-sharp defense mechanism. He knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror for years after the war. I expect you not to break my ship, Edward said flatly. And I expect you to help with the chores if you are going to eat my food. Beyond that, I expect nothing. You are free, Jessie. As soon as we touch down somewhere safe, you can walk away. Jessie stared at him for a long moment, searching for the lie. When she did not find it immediately, she looked confused, which seemed to anger her more than the threat. She turned and climbed the ladder without another word. The Wayward Ember was not designed for 5 people. It was a courier vessel built for speed and a crew of 2. With 3 full-grown wolfkin on board, the living quarters felt intimate to the point of claustrophobia. Over the next 2 cycles, Edward refused to call them days. When they were in hyperspace, a fragile ecosystem began to form on the ship. They gathered in the small mess hall, a curved room, dominated by a single table bolted to the floor. Edward sat with a mug of coffee that he had reheated 3 times, watching the scene unfold. Fanny had adapted the fastest. She was sitting on the floor with Nova, a datapad between them. Nova was teaching her English words for specific spaceship parts, and Fanny was teaching Nova Wolfkin terms for family. Pack, Fanny said, pointing to the drawing Nova had made of the 5 of them. Kithra. Kithra, Nova repeated, stumbling over the guttural growl in the middle of the word. Close enough, Fanny laughed, her tail thumping against the metal floor. Mana was less social. She spent her time roaming the ship, touching the walls, listening to the hum of the reactor. She would sit for hours by the viewport watching the swirling lights of hyperspace. Occasionally, she would ask Edward questions that made him uncomfortable. The ship has a heartbeat, she had said to him earlier, while he was running diagnostics. It is tired, like you. It is an old engine, Mana, Edward had replied, keeping his eyes on the screen. It just needs maintenance. It needs rest, she had insisted. So do you. Jessie was the hardest to read. She treated the ship like enemy territory she was scouting. She checked the airlocks. She inspected the weapon locker, which Edward kept locked, though he suspected she could rip the door off if she really wanted to. She watched Edward constantly, her eyes tracking his hands whenever he reached for a tool or a cup. So, what is the plan, Captain? Jessie asked, breaking the silence of the mess hall. She was standing by the door, arms crossed. She refused to sit while Edward was sitting. Edward set his coffee down. We are heading for Concord Hub. It is a massive station in the neutral zone. It is the administrative center for the sector. The Concord? Jesse spat the word like a curse. Bureaucrats. They watched while our world burned during the war, and they watched while the slavers put collars on us. They are also the only place with a functional legal system that recognizes refugee status for undocumented species, Edward countered. If I drop you off on a rim world, you will be in a cage again within a week. At the hub, I can file for amnesty. I can get you temporary IDs. You can get jobs, real ones. And if they arrest us? Jesse asked. They won't, Edward said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The war is over. The Conquered is trying to rebuild its image. Saving 3 Wolfkin from a dying market is good PR. They will stamp your papers, give you a settlement grant, and pat themselves on the back. You trust them too much, Jesse muttered. I trust the law more than I trust the chaos out here, Edward said. I am a father, Jesse. I need stability. I cannot run a pirate ship. You are a smuggler, Jesse pointed out. I am a freelancer with a flexible moral compass, Edward corrected. There is a distinction. Jesse snorted a sound that was almost a laugh. It was the first time her face had lost that hard warrior's edge. Flexible moral compass. I will remember that. The moment was interrupted by a sharp electronic chime. Not from the ship's console, but from the table. Mana, who had joined them silently, was holding one of the metal collars. They had managed to remove them using Fanny's engineering skills and Edward's laser cutter, but Mana had kept them. She was turning it over in her hands. Put that away, Mana, Fanny said nervously. I hate looking at them. It is warm, Mana whispered. Her eyes were wide, the pupils dilating until they swallowed the iris. It is singing. On the smooth, dark metal of the collar, a series of runes began to glow. They were not the standard blocky text of Galactic Basic, nor the jagged script of the Wolfkin. They were elegant flowing lines of blue light that pulsed with a rhythmic beat. That is not standard tech, Edward said, leaning forward, his pilot instincts flaring. That looks like arc energy, Mana finished. Suddenly, the ship's warning system blared. A red light began to flash in the corridor. Proximity alert, Jesse asked instantly, dropping into a combat stance. No, Edward shouted, bolting for the cockpit. That is a tracking ping. Someone just locked onto us. He threw himself into the pilot's seat, Nova scrambling in behind him. His fingers flew across the board. The signal is coming from inside the ship. It is the collars. They are beacons. I thought you disabled the remote link, Jesse yelled, running onto the bridge. I disabled the slave control, Edward shouted back. I didn't know they had deep-layer subspace transmitters built into the alloy Mana. Get those things to the airlock. Wait, Mana said, entering the cockpit. She held the glowing collar with a strange reverence. It is not just a transmitter. It is a key. I do not care if it is the key to the royal treasury. Throw it out the airlock, Edward ordered. Mana hesitated, then nodded. She ran back toward the cargo hold. Edward watched the sensors. A signal had gone out. A pulse of high-frequency data punching through hyperspace. Somewhere, someone was listening. Light years away in the obsidian interior of a dreadnought-class vessel, a console chimed. The ship was dark, lit only by the bioluminescent fungi that grew in intricate patterns along the walls, a dragon aesthetic. The air was thick and humid. Calyx sat on a throne made of fused meteorite iron. He was a dragon of the old breed, massive, and scaled in deep crimson, but he wore the robes of a scholar mage rather than armor. A monocle equipped with arcane sensors covered his left eye. He looked at the display. 3 distinct signatures had just flared to life on his map. Found you, Calyx rumbled. His voice sounded like grinding stones. My little lost investments. He tapped a claw on the armrest. Navigator, adjust course. The Heirs are moving toward the Conquered hub. Intercept them, and prepare the containment rituals. I do not want them damaged. I want them compliant. The journey to Conquered hub took 3 more days. 3 days of looking over their shoulders. 3 days of silence where every creak of the hull sounded like a boarding party. They had jettisoned the collars, blowing them out of the airlock in a cloud of debris, but the damage was done. They had been marked. The atmosphere on the ship changed. The tentative peace was replaced by a grim determination. Jesse and Edward argued constantly. It became their way of processing the stress. "We should have gone to the asteroid belt," Jesse argued, pacing the small bridge, while Edward monitored the nav computer. "We could have hidden there. The conquered hub is a trap. It is a cage with nicer walls." "The belt is ruled by cartels," Edward shot back, rubbing his temples. "I am not taking my 10-year-old daughter to a place where people sell oxygen by the breath. The hub has security. It has fleets." "Security for who?" Jessie leaned over his chair, her presence overwhelming. "For the people who buy us, Edward. Not for the merchandise." "You are not merchandise anymore," Edward snapped, swiveling his chair around to face her. "Stop acting like it. You are a person. You have rights." "I have rights because you say I do," Jessie snarled. "You decide where we go. You decide what we eat. You decide our fate. How is that different from the masters? You are just a benevolent dictator." "I am the captain," Edward yelled, his voice echoing in the small space. "And on this ship that means I am responsible for your lives. If you die, it is on me. So yes, I decide. Because I know how to fly this ship and you do not." They glared at each other inches apart. Edward could see the gold flecks in her furious eyes. He could smell the scent of her anger, ozone and musk. Then Jessie pulled back. She looked away, her chest heaving. "I hate being helpless," she whispered. "I know," Edward said, his voice softening. "I hate it too." Later that evening, the ship encountered an arc scar field, a region of space where the fabric of reality had been torn by the super weapons of the Ember War. The sensors showed nothing but static, but the visual feeds showed twisting ribbons of impossible light colors that hurt the human eye. Most pilots would have dropped out of hyperspace and gone around, adding weeks to the trip. Edward flew straight through. Mana sat in the co-pilot seat, this time watching him. Edward's eyes were half closed. His hands moved on the yoke with a gentle, rhythmic precision, guiding the ship through invisible currents. He wasn't looking at the sensors. He was feeling the ship slide through the gaps in the chaos. "You are an anchor," Mana said softly. Edward flinched. "I am a pilot." "You feel the break," Mana insisted. "You feel where the world is broken, and you hold the line. That is why you could fly through the blockade at Keros. That is why you saved us. You cannot stand things being broken." "It is just experience, Mana," Edward muttered, banking the ship sharply to avoid a ripple of purple distortion. "Do not make it mystical." "The arc is not mystical," Mana said. "It is energy, and you resonate with it. That is dangerous, Edward. Those who feel the arc can be consumed by it." "Add it to the list of things trying to kill me," Edward quipped, but his hands tightened on the controls. He had never told anyone about the sensations he felt when he flew near the scars. The way the universe seemed to sing to him, begging him to stitch it back together. That night, Edward found Jessie in the mess hall. She was trying to rebandage a cut on her arm, a parting gift from the cage on Keros 4 that hadn't healed properly. She was struggling with the adhesive strip, her claws getting in the way. "Let me," Edward said from the doorway. Jessie stiffened, then sighed. She extended her arm. Edward sat opposite her. He opened the first aid kit and took out an antiseptic wipe. He worked in silence, cleaning the wound with gentle, practiced movements. His hands were rough-scarred from years of engine repair, but his touch was incredibly light. "You have good hands," Jessie murmured, watching him. "Part of the job," Edward said, focusing on the bandage. "Can't fix a fuel injector if you are clumsy." "Why did you really do it?" Jessie asked. "And do not give me the empty cargo hold speech." Edward finished the bandage. He didn't let go of her arm immediately. He looked at the scars that crisscrossed her skin, marks of a life lived in violence. "I was a courier during the war," Edward said quietly. I had orders. Drop the supply, leave the zone. Do not stop for refugees. Do not stop for stragglers. Speed is life. He looked up at her. I left a lot of people behind, Jesse. Good people. I followed the rules and I survived. But every time I look in the mirror, I see the ones I left. He ran a thumb over the fresh white bandage on her arm. When I saw you in that cage, I just couldn't leave one more person behind. Not again. It was selfish, really. I did it for me. Jessie looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. Her hand was larger than his, stronger, the pads of her fingers rough. It wasn't selfish, she whispered. It was human. They sat there for a moment, the silence between them heavy with something new. It wasn't quite romance, it was too raw for that, but it was a recognition. A tether forming between two soldiers who were tired of the war. Edward pulled his hand away gently, clearing his throat. We arrive at Concord Hub in 4 hours. Get some sleep. Jessie nodded, but her eyes lingered on him as he left the room. Concord Hub was a marvel of engineering. It was a city-sized tourist station, spinning slowly against the backdrop of a nebula. Thousands of ships swarmed around it like bees, around a hive freighters, diplomatic cruisers, patrol skiffs. It was a beacon of light and civilization in the dark frontier. Look at the size of it! Nova pressed her face against the cockpit glass. Big, Fanny agreed, peering over Nova's shoulder. Lots of people, lots of food. Ideally, Edward said. He hailed the station. Concord Control, this is freighter Wayward Ember requesting docking clearance. Casual transport submitting ID for scan. Copy, Wayward Ember, a bored voice crackled back. Maintain Vector 25. Prepare for bioscan and cargo manifest check. Edward felt his breath hitch. This was the moment. The scan beam washed over the ship, a blue wave of light that passed through the hull. Just standard procedure, Edward reassured the Wolfkin, who were huddled in the rear of the cockpit. They are looking for contraband. Weapons, drugs, unstable isotopes. Or us, Jessie muttered. Minutes ticked by. The radio remained silent. The station loomed larger, filling the view. Concord controlled a Wayward Ember, the voice returned. It sounded different now, less bored, more official. We are clearing you for docking Bay 99. Proceed immediately. Bay 99. Edward frowned. That is in the secondary ring. I usually dock in the commercial sector. Traffic congestion, the controller said smoothly. Bay 99 is open. Please comply. Edward looked at Jessie. She shook her head slightly. Don't do it. If I turn around now, they will send interceptors, Edward whispered. We have to bluff it out. He guided the ship into the massive docking bay. As the clamps locked onto the hull, Edward noticed something. The bay was empty. No other ships. No cargo loaders. Just a pristine white hangar. This feels wrong, Mana said, her hackles rising. The airlock cycled. Edward went down to the ramp alone, ordering the others to stay out of sight. When the ramp lowered, he wasn't met by a customs droid or a cargo clerk. He was met by a squad of Concord security officers. They weren't pointing weapons, but their hands were resting on their holsters. They were a mix of species human catfolk and a large reptilian officer. Captain Edward, the lead officer, a human woman with a stern face, asked. That is me, Edward said, leaning casually against the hydraulic strut. Is there a problem, officer? I have bioglass to offload. We registered a signal anomaly from your vessel, the officer said, and a discrepancy in your biological mass reading. We need you and your passengers to accompany us to the intake center. Passengers? Edward feigned innocence. I am hauling glass. Captain, the officer's voice dropped an octave. We know they are on board. The biological signatures match the dispute profiles filed 3 days ago. Please, don't make this a scene. We just want to sort out the paperwork. Dispute profiles. That was legal speak for stolen property. Edward looked back up the ramp. Jessie was standing there just inside the shadow of the airlock. She looked ready to charge. Edward held up a hand, signaling her to stand down. "Trust me," he mouthed. He turned back to the officer. "Fine, but my daughter comes with me, and nobody touches them. They are refugees claiming asylum." "We will process the claim," the officer said neutrally. "This way." The holding room was white, aggressively, blindingly white. The chairs were bolted to the floor and molded from hard plastic that seemed designed to cause back pain. One wall was a large mirror, obviously one-way glass. They had been waiting for 2 hours. Nova was curled up in a chair, hugging her knees. "Are you going to jail, Dad?" she asked in a small voice. "No, Peanut," Edward said, pacing the length of the room. "Nobody is going to jail. It is just a misunderstanding." "They took our names," Fanny said nervously, tapping her claws on the armrest. "They took pictures of our teeth." "Why did they look at our teeth?" "Identification," Mana said. She was standing in the corner, her eyes closed, humming a low, dissonant tune. "They are checking the registry." Jessie sat like a statue, staring at the mirror. She knew people were watching them. "I should have fought them," she murmured. "I could have taken the lizard on the left." "And then what?" Edward stopped pacing. "We would be dead and Nova would be an orphan in the system. Fighting isn't always the answer, Jessie." "It is the only answer that works," Jessie retorted. "Not here," Edward said. "Here we fight with words. We fight with laws." "Your laws are what put us in cages," Jessie said bitterly. Before Edward could respond, the large screen on the wall buzzed to life. The conquered insignia, a stylized handshake between 3 hands, spun on the screen. A face appeared. It was a bureaucrat, a catfolk with reading glasses perched on his nose. "Case number 449 Alpha," the catfolk read from a file. "Regarding the biological assets recovered from the Keros sector. A hearing has been scheduled for this afternoon before the High Council." "A hearing?" Edward stepped toward the screen. "I demand a lawyer. I want to file for asylum status under the Ember Concordat Section 7. The bureaucrat looked up unmoved. "The asylum claim has been noted. However, a counterclaim has been filed by the registered owner of the assets. He has produced a valid bill of sale and a bonding contract." The owner, Edward, felt a cold chill run down his spine. "The claimant has arrived at the station," the bureaucrat continued. "He will present his evidence at the hearing. You are advised to prepare your statement." The screen went black. "He is here," Mana whispered. The humming stopped. "The dragon is here." The camera view on the wall monitor switched to an external feed of the station. A ship was approaching the docking pylons. It was not a freighter. It was a sleek, black dreadnought, jagged and terrifying, its hull etched with glowing red runes. It moved like a predator, swimming through dark water. Calyx had arrived. Edward looked at the 3 Wolfkin women. Fanny was shaking. Mana looked resigned. Jessie looked like she was about to explode. And Nova looked at him terrified. Edward took a deep breath. He adjusted his jacket. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a plan. He had 3 wolf women, a 10-year-old girl, and a mouth that got him into trouble. "Okay," Edward said, his voice hard. "They want a hearing. Let's give them a show." The corridor leading to the High Council chamber of Concord Hub was long, sterile, and aggressively silent. It was a silence designed to make anyone walking it feel small, an architectural intimidation tactic that Edward recognized from his brief, unhappy dealings with military tribunals during the war. The floor was polished white composite, reflecting the overhead strip lights so perfectly that it looked like they were walking on a frozen lake. Edward walked in the lead, though his legs felt heavy, as if the artificial gravity had been cranked up just for him. He adjusted the collar of his flight jacket, a nervous tick he couldn't suppress. Beside him, Nova held his hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a 10-year-old. She was not skipping today. Her eyes were wide, darting between the towering security drones flanking the doors. Behind them came the Wolfkin. Jessie walked with a predator's gait, silent and coiled. She had refused the station's offer of a standard-issue jumpsuit, opting instead to wash and repair her rags from the bonding pen. She looked like a refugee, but she walked like a general inspecting enemy lines. Mana was beside her, her eyes half-closed fingers, twitching as she sensed the electromagnetic hum of the station. Fanny brought up the rear, looking pale. She kept adjusting a small tool pouch she had scavenged from the wayward Ember, her security blanket in this palace of bureaucracy. "Dad," Nova whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are they going to put us back in a cage?" "No," Edward said, his voice sounding steadier than he felt. "Nobody goes in a cage today. I promise." The massive double doors at the end of the hall slid open with a deep, resonant thrum. The council chamber was a tiered amphitheater. The walls were made of transparent aluminum, offering a panoramic view of the station's busy traffic lanes and the star-strewn void beyond. In the center of the room, a raised platform awaited them. The council sat in a semicircle above the platform. There was a dragon elder, his scales faded to a dusty slate gray, wearing robes of diplomatic silk. A vampire matron sat in a shaded pod, her pale features sharp and ageless. A catfolk representative cleaned his monocle with a velvet cloth-looking board. A human admiral, decorated with medals from the Ember War, watched Edward with cold calculation. And a wolfkin elder sat at the edge, his face a mask of stone. "Approach the podium," the dragon elder rumbled. His voice was amplified, filling the room. Edward stepped onto the platform. The three wolfkin women and Nova stood just behind him. "This is Case 449 Alpha," the catfolk representative announced, reading from a holographic display. "Captain Edward of the freighter Wayward Ember stands accused of theft of biological assets, violation of trade routes, and harboring fugitives. The claimants are present." "We are not fugitives," Edward said, his voice echoing slightly. "And they are not assets. They are people." "That is a matter of legal definition," the human admiral cut in. "You admit to removing them from Keros 4 without a transfer of ownership." "I admit to saving them from a slow death on a dying rock," Edward shot back. "I saw 3 sentient beings being sold like cattle. The Ember Concordate Section, 7 Paragraph 2, states that any sentient being found in immediate distress within a collapsing biosphere is eligible for emergency extraction. I followed the law." "You followed a loophole," the vampire matron hissed softly, "and you conveniently ignored the property rights of the merchant." "Property rights," the voice came from behind Edward. Jessie stepped forward. She did not ask for permission. She moved past Edward and stood at the very edge of the podium, looking up at the wolfkin elder in the council. "My name is Jessie," she said. Her voice was rough, unpolished, but it carried a raw power that made the catfolk stop cleaning his monocle. "I am not an asset. I am not a line item on a ledger. I am a warrior of the wolfkin. My sisters and I were drugged, collared, and dragged to that market. We did not consent to be sold. If this council honors the blood of the ancestors," she stared hard at the wolfkin elder, "then you know that a wolf in chains is a crime against nature." The wolfkin elder shifted in his seat, his ears flattening slightly. "Your passion is noted, child, but the law requires evidence of coercion." "The evidence is the collar burns on our necks," Jessie shouted, pointing to the faint scars on her skin. "Emotional outburst will not help your case," the human admiral said dismissively. "We need to hear from the legal owner." The doors hissed open again. Edward turned, and the blood in his veins turned to ice. Calyx did not walk into the room. He made an entrance. He was a dragon of the old breed, tall and broad-shouldered, but he wore the attire of a high-ranking corporate mage, a tailored suit of dark weave over a chest-piece of polished obsidian. He held a cane topped with a pulsating red crystal, though he clearly did not need it to walk. He moved with a terrifying fluid grace, his eyes burning with arcane intelligence, locking instantly onto the three sisters. My apologies for the delay, counselors, Calyx said. His voice was smooth, like oil pouring over gravel. Traffic in the docking sector is atrocious. He stepped up to a secondary podium. He did not look at Edward. He looked at the council. I am Calyx Warmage of the Obsidian Circle. I have here, he tapped a datapad on the podium, the bill of sale from the Keros Guild signed and notarized. I also have the original bonding contracts. These 3 females were not kidnapped. They were indentured to my service to pay off the debts of their clan, a standard practice in the rim sectors. Liar, Fanny squeaked from the back, clutching Nova's hand. Calyx ignored her. This human pilot, he gestured vaguely at Edward, is nothing more than a pirate. He stole my property, damaged my tracking hardware, and fled the system. I demand the return of my assets and the impounding of his vessel as compensation. Edward stepped forward, his fists clenched. Debts? What debts? They were in cages starving. You call that indentured service? I call it asset protection, Calyx smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp for a civilian. The atmosphere on Keros was failing. I purchased them to move them to a safer environment. You, Captain, interfered with a humanitarian rescue mission. The audacity of the lie struck Edward like a physical blow. He looked at the council. They were wavering. The paper trail was clean. Calyx had the documents. Edward had nothing but morality, and in a courtroom morality was a flimsy shield. The law is clear, the Dragon Elder said slowly. If the contracts are valid. The contracts are forged, Edward yelled. Look at them. They are barely adults. How could they accrue clan debt? It is inherited debt, Calyx said smoothly. Tragic but legal. Edward looked at Jessie. She was shaking with rage, her claws digging into the podium rail. If she attacked Calyx now, they would be executed by the security drones. This system is broken, Edward said, his voice low. If you hand them back to him, you are not upholding the law. You are upholding a crime. We are upholding order, Captain, the human admiral said. Something a freelancer like you would not understand. Calyx tapped his cane on the floor. I believe we have heard enough. I will take my property now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. It looked like a remote, but it was crafted from the same dark metal as the collars. No, Mana whispered. Her eyes went wide, turning entirely black. He has the anchor stone. Calyx pressed a sequence on the device. It was not a loud noise. It was a sensation, a vibration that started in the teeth and ended in the marrow of the bone. The lights in the council chamber flickered. The transparent aluminum walls hummed. What is the meaning of this? The vampire matron demanded, standing up. Just a security precaution, Calyx said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming more guttural. To ensure no further resistance. He twisted the dial on the device. In the center of the room, between the podiums, the air ripped. It looked like someone had taken a knife to a painting. A vertical gash of blinding white light appeared in thin air. It crackled with the sound of 1,000 panes of glass shattering at once. An arc scar. The council screamed. The Dragon Elder shielded his eyes. The security drones spun confusedly, their sensors blinded by the sudden surge of exotic radiation. You are insane, Edward shouted over the roaring noise. You opened a scar inside a pressurized station. You will kill us all. I will control it, Calyx roared, his facade of civility dropping. The air around him warped heat, shimmering off his scales. I only need enough power to subdue the unruly. Give them to me, Council, and I will close the rift. It was blackmail, terrorism. He was holding the entire station hostage with a tear in reality. The scar widened. The floor plates began to buckle. Gravity fluctuated, throwing the catfolk representative out of his chair. Edward felt it then. It hit him harder than the noise or the light. It was a sickness in his gut, a wrongness that felt like his own skin was being pulled inside out. He could feel the edges of the universe fraying. He could feel the chaotic energy of the arc pouring into the dimension, hungry and mindless. This was his secret. The reason he was the best pilot in the sector. The reason he survived the war. He was an anchor. He could feel the structure of the rift. He could see the stitching that had come undone. "Dad!" Nova screamed, clinging to a railing as the platform tilted. Edward looked at Calyx. The dragon was struggling. The device was getting hot in his hand. The rift was growing faster than he anticipated. He had bitten off more than he could chew. He cannot close it, Edward realized. He is going to kill everyone. Edward looked at Jessie, Mana, and Fanny. They were huddled around Nova. They were looking at him. If he did nothing, the station would break apart. If he acted, he would reveal what he was. He would be a target for every government and corporation in the galaxy. Anchors were rare, valuable, and usually dissected in labs. He looked at Nova's terrified face. To hell with the secret. "Jessie!" Edward yelled. "Hold the line!" He didn't wait for an answer. Edward ran. Not away from the danger, but straight into it. "Captain!" the human admiral shouted. "Get back!" Edward sprinted up the sloped floor and threw himself toward the blinding white tear in reality. He didn't burn. As he hit the edge of the arc scar, his body didn't disintegrate. Instead, it glowed. A lattice of golden energy, his own biofield reacting to the arc, flared out from his chest. He slammed his hands into the empty air on either side of the rift, as if he were holding open the jaws of a beast. "Close!" Edward screamed. The sound was lost in the roar of energy, but the effect was immediate. The widening tear stopped. It shuddered, fighting him. The pain was absolute. It felt like electricity was being pumped through his veins instead of blood. Edward's back arched, his teeth clenched so hard he thought they would shatter. He was becoming the bridge between the chaotic dimension and the physical world, forcing the door shut with sheer will. "He is an anchor!" the dragon elder gasped, standing up in awe. Edward's knees buckled. The energy was too much. It was crushing him. He felt his heart stutter, missing a beat, then two. He was going to die here. "Edward!" Mana's voice cut through the noise. She was there suddenly, right beside him. She didn't touch the rift. She placed her hands on Edward's shoulders. "Listen to the rhythm," Mana shouted. She began to chant a low, guttural wolfkin throat song that vibrated through Edward's body. It wasn't magic. It was a biorhythm sync, an ancient technique used by wolfkin packs to share stamina during long hunts. Edward felt a surge of strength that wasn't his. Mana was pouring her own life force into him, stabilizing his erratic heartbeat. "I cannot hold it," Edward gasped. The gravity of the rift was trying to suck him in. Then arms wrapped around his waist. Strong, muscular arms. Jessie dug her heels into the buckling floor plates. She wrapped herself around Edward from behind, anchoring him to the physical world. "I have you!" Jessie roared in his ear. "You do not get to leave. Pull, pilot, pull!" She was a solid weight against his back, a reminder of the reality he was fighting for. "Fanny!" Edward choked out. "The source, kill the source." Fanny was already moving, while Calyx was distracted by the impossible sight of a human wrestling a wormhole. The smallest wolfkin had flanked him. Calyx raised his cane to strike her, but Fanny was faster. She didn't attack him. She attacked the tech. She slid under his guard, pulling a localized EMP spike from her pouch, something she had built on the ship during the trip. "Error 404 lizard brain," Fanny screamed, and jammed the spike directly into the pulsating device in Calyx's hand. Crack. The device exploded. Calyx howled as the backlash threw him across the room, slamming him into the transparent wall. With the control signal severed, the arc scar lost its driving force. But it didn't vanish quietly. It tried to collapse inward, threatening to take Edward with it. "Now!" Edward screamed. He pushed. He used every ounce of the anchor power he had hidden for 20 years. He visualized the fabric of space knitting together, stitch by glowing stitch. The light flared one last time, a blinding, silent flash that washed out all color in the room. And then it was gone. Silence rushed back into the chamber like a flood. Edward stood there for 1 second, smoke rising from his flight jacket, his hands trembling. Then his eyes rolled back and he fell. He didn't hit the floor. Jessie caught him. She lowered him gently, cradling his head in her lap. "Edward," her voice was shaking. "Edward, breathe." The room was spinning. Edward forced his eyes open. The ceiling lights were blurry. He saw Jessie's face above him, her amber eyes wide with panic. She looked terrifying and beautiful. "Did we win?" he wheezed. "You idiot!" Jessie hissed, but her hand was stroking his hair, checking for injuries. "You absolute idiot. If you die on me, I will drag you back from the afterlife with my teeth and claws. Do you hear me?" Edward managed a weak, lopsided grin. "That sounds painful." He coughed, tasting ozone. "I would rather we just go on a first date." "Coffee, I know a place cheap." Jessie froze. Then a laugh, half sob, half chuckle, escaped her. She pressed her forehead against his for a brief second. "Coffee, fine, but you are paying." "Deal," Edward whispered, and let the darkness take him. The medical bay of Concord Hub was a significant upgrade from the first aid kit on the Wayward Ember. It smelled of lavender and antiseptic. Edward woke up to the sound of rhythmic beeping. He felt heavy, but the pain was gone, replaced by a dull ache in his bones. He opened his eyes. Nova was asleep in a chair next to his bed, her head resting on the mattress. She was holding his hand. On the other side of the room, sitting on a windowsill and looking out at the stars, was Jessie. She was wearing a clean flight suit now, one that actually fit her. "You snore," Jessie said without turning around. "It is a tactical defense mechanism," Edward croaked. His throat felt like he had swallowed sandpaper. "Keeps the predators away." Jessie turned. She hopped off the windowsill and walked over to the bed. She looked tired, but the haunted look from the cages was gone. "How long?" Edward asked. 2 days, Jessie said. She poured a glass of water and handed it to him. "You burned out your nervous system. Dr. Alrin said you are lucky your brain didn't melt." "And Calyx?" "Gone." Jessie's expression darkened. "He fled on a shuttle while the council was digging themselves out of the rubble. His dreadnought jumped away before security could lock it down. He is in the wind." "He will be back," Edward said, drinking the water greedily. "Let him come," Jessie said fiercely. "We will be ready." The door to the medical bay slid open. The human admiral and the Wolfkin elder walked in. They looked different now, less arrogant, more respectful. "Captain," the admiral nodded. "Good to see you awake." "Am I under arrest?" Edward asked, handing the glass back to Jessie. "Hardly," the Wolfkin elder rumbled. "You saved the High Council and the station. The Ark incident clarified the situation. Calyx's actions were an act of war. His claim on the sisters is null and void." The admiral placed a datapad on the bedside table. "The council has granted full amnesty and citizenship to Jessie, Mana, and Fanny. And for you, Captain," he paused. "We do not usually employ anchors. They are too dangerous. But we recognize a debt when we see one. You have been granted the title of Free Passage Captain. No port fees, no customs checks, and diplomatic immunity in conquered space, provided you use your talents for the stability of the region." "I am just a cargo hauler," Edward muttered. "Not anymore," the Wolfkin elder said. He looked at Jessie. "You chose a strong alpha daughter, even if he is a human." Jessie crossed her arms. "He is not my alpha. He is my pilot. There is a difference." The elder chuckled a dry, raspy sound. "Rest well, Captain. We will hold a ceremony when you can stand." They left. Edward looked at Jessie. "Free passage, Captain. Sounds fancy." "Sounds like more trouble," Jessie smirked. 3 days later, the ceremony was brief. Edward stood leaning slightly on a cane the doctors had insisted he use for balance, while the council pinned a platinum emblem on his jacket. Nova beamed, wearing a new dress that Fanny had somehow tailored for her. Mana and Fanny stood by, holding their own citizenship papers, like they were made of gold. But the real reward came afterward. As they were packing the Wayward Ember for departure, a courier drone arrived at the docking bay. It didn't carry cargo. It carried a single, sealed data chip. "For the captain," the drone chirped, and dropped the chip into Edward's hand before buzzing away. Edward plugged it into his data pad. A holographic projection shimmered into existence. It was an old Wolfkin woman. She had kind eyes and a face lined with wisdom. She wore simple robes, but there was an authority in her posture that transcended clothing. "Hello, Edward," the hologram said. Her voice was warm, like a hearth fire. Jessie, Mana, and Fanny stopped what they were doing. They gathered around the pad. "My name is Rosa," the woman continued. "I have been watching you for a long time, pilot. You have a habit of leaving nutrient bars for ghosts. It is a good habit." Edward frowned. "Who is she?" "I heard what you did at the hub," Rosa said. "You protected my kin when the world wanted to sell them. But the story is not over. The collars Calyx used, they were not just slave tech. They were keys. And the girls you saved are not just soldiers." The hologram leaned in. "Come to the Aurora Crown Sanctuary. I think it is time you and your family learned the truth about what you are carrying. And Edward, the coffee is better here." The transmission ended with a set of coordinates. "Aurora Crown," Mana whispered. "That is the sanctuary. The hidden place. It is a myth." "Apparently not," Edward said, looking at the coordinates. He looked at his motley crew. Jessie polishing her new blaster. Fanny eating a bag of chips. Mana staring at the stars. And Nova drawing a picture of Rosa on her sketchpad. "Well," Edward said, tossing the cane into the corner of the cockpit. "We have free passage. We have a full tank of fuel. And we have an invitation from a mysterious old lady." He sat in the pilot's seat and fired up the engines. The Wayward Ember hummed a happy, eager sound. "Strap in," Edward smiled, looking at Jessie in the co-pilot seat. "Let's go see a myth." The clamps released. The ship drifted away from the glittering lights of Concord Hub, turning its nose toward the deep, unknown dark. The thrusters flared blue, and with a sonic boom that rattled the station's windows, the Wayward Ember vanished into the stars. Ahead of them, in the distance, the faint, shimmering ring of the Aurora Crown began to rise like a dawn. The journey from Concord Hub to the Aurora Crown Sanctuary took 9 standard days, a stretch of time that felt both agonizingly slow and frighteningly fast for the crew of the Wayward Ember. The ship, usually a quiet vessel of solitary routines, had become a hive of nervous energy-healing wounds and the awkward, stumbling integration of a found family. Edward spent the first 3 days in the pilot's bunk, not because he wanted to, but because Jessie had made it very clear that if he tried to touch the flight controls with his tremors, she would tie him to the mattress. The use of the anchor power at the hub had left him feeling hollowed out, as if his nervous system had been stripped of its insulation. Every loud noise made his teeth ache. Every sudden light made his eyes water. "Drink," Jessie ordered, shoving a mug of something green and pungent under his nose. Edward propped himself up on his elbows, wincing as his spine protested. "I am the captain," he grumbled, though he took the mug. "I should be flying the ship." "The ship is on autopilot and Nova is monitoring the comms," Jessie said, crossing her arms. She was wearing one of his spare flight shirts, the sleeves rolled up to accommodate her muscular forearms. "You are drinking kale algae concentrate. Dr. Alrin at the hub said your electrolytes were non-existent. Drink." Edward drank. It tasted like wet grass and copper, but the shaking in his hands subsided by a fraction. "You are a tyrant, Jessie." "I am efficient," she corrected, taking the empty mug. "Rest. If I hear your boots on the deck before 12 hours are up, I am locking the door." Outside the captain's quarters, the ship was changing. Nova had taken it upon herself to decorate for their arrival. The gray metal bulkheads of the corridor were now plastered with drawings. There were sketches of dragon mages eating ice cream vampires, sunbathing with umbrellas, and Wolfkin playing fetch. It was a gallery of optimism taped over the scars of a war surplus freighter. In the mess hall, Fanny was currently dismantling the toaster. "It is not broken, Fanny," Mana said, from the corner where she was staring out the viewport at the shifting colors of hyperspace. "It toasts unevenly," Fanny muttered, her tongue protruding slightly between her teeth as she rewired the heating element. "A 70-30 burn ratio is unacceptable. I can get it to 50-50 if I bypass the safety regulator. Besides, if we are going to this sanctuary, I want to make sure we have good toast. It is a free vacation, Mana. We need to look presentable, and that includes our breakfast." Mana did not answer immediately. She pressed her hand against the thick glass of the viewport. "We are getting close," she whispered. "The currents are changing. The arc scars, they are quiet here." Soothed. Mana had spent the journey in a state of quiet reverence, while Fanny dealt with trauma through humor and mechanics, and Jessie through control and discipline. Mana had turned inward. She had felt Edward's power during the incident at the hub, and it had awakened something in her, a connection to the energy of the universe that she was still trying to understand. When the nav computer finally chimed, signaling their arrival, Edward was allowed back in the pilot's seat. He looked better, though the lines around his eyes were deeper than before. "Dropping out of hyperspace in 3-2-1, Edward announced. The stars stretched and snapped back into points of light, and there, floating in the void like a jewel in a sea of coal, was the Aurora Crown. It was not a station in the traditional sense. It was a masterpiece. A massive toroidal ring, easily 20 miles in diameter, spun slowly around a central spire of crystalline rock. But unlike the industrial gray of the hub, or the decaying brown of Keros 4, the crown was green and blue and gold. A shimmering energy field, translucent and iridescent, like the surface of a soap bubble held in a breathable atmosphere. Through the field, they could see forests, lakes, and floating islands connected by vines of light. "It is a garden," Nova breathed, unbuckling her harness and pressing her face against the glass. "It is a fortress disguised as a garden," Jessie noted, her tactical eye, spotting the subtle shimmer of heavy shield generators masked by the floating islands. "Standard defensive grid, but the output is massive." "Aurora controlled a wayward ember," a voice crackled over the comms. It wasn't the robotic drone of a traffic controller. It was a warm, melodic voice, sounding more like a greeting from a neighbor than a clearance check. "Welcome home, travelers. We have been waiting for you. Please proceed to docking Spire 7. The wind is calm today." "Copy that, Control," Edward said, his voice softening. Proceeding to Spire 7. As they drifted closer, the scale of the place became apparent. Ships of all designs were docked at the wooden and steel piers that jutted out from the central spire. Dragon skiffs, vampire solar sailors, heavy catfolk traders. But there was no chaos, no blaring horns, just a gentle, orderly flow. Edward guided the wayward ember into the cradle. The landing clamps didn't clang. They engaged with a soft, magnetic hum. "Engine shut down," Edward said. He sat back, letting his hands fall from the yoke. For the first time in 20 years, the silence of the shutdown didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a pause. They gathered at the airlock. Edward, Nova, Jessie, Mana, and Fanny. A human pilot, a child, and 3 Wolfkin fugitives. The ramp lowered. Instead of the smell of recycled air and ozone, the scent that rushed in was overwhelming. It smelled of damp earth, pine needles, blooming jasmine, and rain. Edward stepped out first. He looked up. Above them, instead of a metal ceiling, there was a simulated sky, a soft twilight blue, with bioluminescent creatures drifting like lazy clouds. "Welcome," a catfolk attendant said, bowing slightly. He wore simple linen robes rather than a uniform. "The Lady Rosa is expecting you in the solar garden." They walked through the station, and it was like walking through a dream. The architecture was a fusion of all the major species. There were the high Gothic arches favored by vampires, the organic grown stone structures of the dragons, and the warm wooden dens of the Wolfkin. And everywhere there were people. But they weren't segregated. In a courtyard, Edward saw a young dragon playing a board game with a vampire elder, while a group of human children chased a robotic ball. "How is this possible?" Mana whispered, looking at the energy lines that ran through the ground like veins of gold. "The different species, they do not mix like this. Not really." "They do here," Edward said. He felt a lump in his throat. This was the galaxy he had fought for, the one he had thought was destroyed when the Ember War began. They reached the solar garden, a massive open space dominated by a central tree with leaves of silver glass. Sitting on a wooden bench beneath the tree was an old wolfkin woman. She wore a simple gray tunic and a shawl woven with geometric patterns. Her fur was white with age, and her eyes were crinkled at the corners, holding a lifetime of smiles and sorrows. She stood up as they approached, leaning on a walking stick that looked like a twisted root. "Edward," she said. Her voice was the one from the hologram, warm, resonant, and undeniably commanding. "And Nova. And the Daughters of the Storm." She didn't wait for formal introductions. She walked straight to Jessie, Mana, and Fanny. The three sisters stiffened, their instincts wary, but Rosa simply opened her arms. It wasn't a regal gesture. It was a grandmother's gesture. "You have been running for so long," Rosa said softly. "You can put the burden down now." Hesitantly, Fanny stepped forward, then Mana, finally Jessie. Rosa embraced them, a collective hug that seemed to swallow their fear. Fanny let out a small sob, burying her face in the old woman's shoulder. Edward stood back, holding Nova's hand, watching. He felt like an intruder in a private moment, yet he couldn't look away. Rosa pulled back, patting Jessie's cheek. Then she turned her gaze to Edward. Her eyes locked onto his, and the warmth remained, but there was a sharpness there too. A recognition. "The anchor," Rosa said, stepping toward him. "You have more gray hair than the last time I saw you." "I did not think we had met," Edward said respectfully. "We haven't. Not face to face," Rosa smiled. "But I remember the signature of your engine. And I remember the feel of your mind holding a collapsing sector together 20 years ago. You were stubborn then too." "I am just a pilot," Edward deflected, the old refrain coming automatically. "And I am just a gardener," Rosa chuckled, gesturing around her. "Come. You must be tired. We have prepared quarters for you. Real beds, hot water, and food that does not come from a packet." The next 10 days at Aurora Crown were a period of decompression that Edward hadn't realized he desperately needed. The constant, low-level hum of anxiety, the fight-or-flight instinct that had been his constant companion, began to fade, replaced by a strange, unsettling peace. The group naturally fragmented, finding their own corners of the sanctuary to heal. Nova was in heaven. She was adopted almost immediately by a group of catfolk children who were fascinated by her drawings. She spent her days in the hydroponic gardens, learning from a vampire botanist named Dr. Varys. Edward had been terrified at first, leaving his daughter with a vampire, but he found Varys teaching Nova how to sing to the luminescent moss to encourage its growth. "They respond to the vibration, little one," Varys had explained, his pale hands gentle on the soil. "Violence destroys. Growth requires a song." Fanny found the engineering district. It turned out that the Aurora Crown's maintenance crew was a chaotic mix of species who treated mechanics as a competitive sport. Fanny fit right in. Within 3 days, she was arguing torque ratios with a dragonsmith and had successfully recalibrated a water filtration unit that had been glitching for a year. She came back to dinner every night covered in grease, grinning like a maniac. Mana disappeared into the archives. Rosa had given her access to the Library of the Ark, a collection of knowledge that had survived the war. She spent hours reading scrolls and holographic tablets tracing the history of the Wolfkin and the nature of the energy that had nearly consumed the galaxy. She spoke less, but her eyes were clearer, less haunted. And Jessie went to the training grounds. Edward found her there on the 5th day. It was an open-air dojo overlooking a waterfall. Jesse was sparring with a Wolfkin guard, a massive male with scars across his chest. They moved with a speed that the human eye struggled to follow, a blur of claws, blocks, and strikes. But it wasn't a death match. It was a dance. Jesse blocked a high kick, swept the guard's leg, and pinned him. "Yield," she growled, but there was no malice in it. "Yield," the guard laughed, tapping the mat. He stood up and offered her a hand. "You have the royal style, sister." "Who taught you?" "Survival," Jesse said, wiping sweat from her brow. She saw Edward watching from the edge of the mat. She froze for a second, then walked over to him. She was breathing hard, her muscles defined under a tank top she had borrowed. "Coming to challenge me, pilot," she teased, though her voice was breathless. "I value my limbs too much," Edward smiled. "I just came to see if you wanted to walk. Rosa said the hanging forest is worth seeing at sunset." Jesse unwrapped the tape from her hands. "A walk. That sounds acceptable." The hanging forest was a suspension bridge system, strung between massive floating islands of vegetation. As the artificial sun of the station began to dim into a twilight setting, the plants began to glow. Blue and purple bioluminescence awoke, turning the forest into a galaxy of its own. They walked in silence for a while, the swaying of the bridge the only movement. "I keep waiting for the alarm," Jesse said suddenly. She stopped in the middle of a bridge, gripping the rope railing. "I wake up every morning waiting for the cage door to slam shut." "It is too quiet here, Edward." Edward stopped beside her. He looked out at the glowing forest. "It is called peace, Jesse. It takes some getting used to. It is louder than war sometimes because you have to listen to your own thoughts." "My thoughts are not kind," she admitted. She looked at him, her amber eyes reflecting the soft light of the forest. "I think about the ones we left behind. I think about what happens next. You are a free passage captain now. You will leave. You have a ship." "The ship is not going anywhere without its crew," Edward said softly. Jesse turned to face him fully. "We are your crew. You are the only ones who know how to kick the engine when it stalls," Edward said. He hesitated, then reached out, covering her hand on the railing with his own. "And I have gotten used to the snoring." Jesse laughed, a soft, genuine sound. She stepped closer. The gap between them was small, charged with the same electricity Edward felt when he touched the ark, but softer, safer. "You are a strange man, Edward," she whispered. "You saved us, you fought a dragon for us, and you still dress like a hobo." "It is a vintage aesthetic," Edward murmured, leaning in slightly. Jessie tilted her head up. Her breath hitched. The air around them seemed to thicken. It was a moment of perfect clarity, a promise of something that could exist beyond survival. "Hey, there you are!" Fanny's voice shattered the moment like a brick through a window. Edward and Jessie sprang apart, as if they had been electrocuted. Fanny came bounding across the bridge carrying a large basket. She was oblivious to the tension, or perhaps she was ignoring it with the expert timing of a younger sister. "I brought buns," Fanny announced, shoving the basket between them. "Steamed meat buns. The catfolk cook showed me how to make them. They are 80% delicious and 20% questionable, but I am hungry." "Did I miss anything?" Jessie cleared her throat. Her face flushed under her fur. "No, nothing. Just looking at the trees." "Nice trees," Fanny nodded, taking a bite of a bun. "Very glowy. Here, Edward, eat. You look skinny." Edward took the bun, sighing. He looked at Jessie, and she offered him a small, secret smile. The moment was gone, but the feeling remained. 2 nights later, the atmosphere at the sanctuary began to shift. It wasn't less peaceful, but it was more purposeful. Dignitaries began to arrive, not in fleets, but in single, unmarked shuttles. A vampire lord who had renounced blood hunting, a dragon matriarch who had brokered the first ceasefire, the leaders of the pacifist movements. Rosa summoned Edward to her private quarters after the evening meal. Her room was simple, filled with books and potted plants. A large window looked out over the curve of the station. "Sit, Edward," Rosa said, pouring him a cup of tea. "It is time we spoke of the past." Edward sat. "You mentioned the Ember War. You said you saw me." "I was on the Exodus 7, Rosa said quietly. "A refugee transport fleeing the burning of the Lyra sector. We were carrying 3,000 souls, Wolfkin human catfolk. We were limping, our engines dying, and the Ark Storm was chasing us." Edward's hand froze on his teacup. The memory hit him hard. He remembered that day. He was a 20-year-old courier in a fast interceptor. He had orders to outrun the storm. "I remember," Edward said hoarsely. "I was ordered to retreat. But the ship, it was heavy. It couldn't break orbit." "And then a small courier ship turned around," Rosa continued, her eyes misty. "It flew into the wake of the transport. It didn't fire weapons. It fired a tow cable, a single magnetic tether. And for 10 minutes that little ship pulled with everything it had. It dragged us out of the gravity well just before the Ark hit." "I burned out my primary thrusters," Edward whispered. "My commander court-martialed me for damaging government property." "You saved 3,000 lives, Edward," Rosa said. "I was one of them. I was holding my own children then. I lost them later to the sickness the war left behind, but because of you, I had 5 more years with them." Edward looked down. He had never told anyone that story. He thought he had failed because he couldn't save everyone. "Why didn't you tell me?" Edward asked. "When we arrived." "Because you needed to stop running from yourself first," Rosa said. "You have spent 20 years thinking you are a survivor of your own cowardice. You needed to realize you are a hero of your own choice. That is what being an anchor is, Edward. It is not just about stabilizing space. It is about stabilizing people. You hold the line when the world breaks." She reached across the table and took his hand. "The girls Jessie, Manafani. They are special. You know this." "They are the heirs," Edward said. "I guessed. The way the Wolfkin elder at the hub looked at them. The way Calyx wanted them. They are the last of the royal bloodline," Rosa confirmed. "My granddaughters. Stolen from the nursery when the palace fell. I have searched for them for 15 years. When I felt your signature near Keros 4, and I felt the resonance of the royal anchors, I knew you had found them. Or they had found you." "Does Jessie know?" "She suspects," Rosa said. "Mana knows. Fanny is trying not to know. Tomorrow we will have a ceremony. Not to crown them, that is a heavy weight for another day, but to name them. To give them back the identity the cages took." "And then?" Edward asked. "Then," Rosa looked at him intently, "they will have a choice to make, and so will you." The days leading up to the ceremony were a blur of quiet preparation. Rosa didn't turn it into a spectacle. There were no parades. Instead, there were small, intimate rituals. The Wolfkin elders who had gathered took the sisters aside. They spent hours in the steam lodges scrubbing the scent of the bonding pens from their skin with aromatic herbs. They sang the old songs, teaching the girls the rhythm of their language, which they had only heard in fragments. Mana took to it instantly. She emerged from the lodge looking regal, her silver fur shining. Fanny complained about the heat, but she looked lighter. The shadow of fear in her eyes, replaced by a spark of pride. Jessie struggled. Edward saw her pacing the gardens at night, wrestling with the idea that she was not just a soldier, but a symbol. "I do not know how to be a princess," Jessie had told him one evening. "Good," Edward had replied. "Princesses are boring. Be a warrior who knows who her grandmother is. That is much more terrifying for the bad guys." The night before the ceremony, the Aurora Crown was alive with a subdued anticipation. The lights in the biosphere were dimmed to a soft gold. Edward couldn't sleep. He left his quarters and walked out onto the balcony that overlooked the central plaza. The air was cool and smelled of night-blooming jasmine. He leaned against the railing, looking down at the glowing forest. He thought about the wayward Ember sitting in the dock. He thought about the open star maps. For the first time, he didn't have a destination in mind. The door to the balcony slid open softly. Jessie stepped out. She was wearing a ceremonial robe of deep midnight blue, embroidered with silver thread. It was elegant, far removed from the flight suit or the rags, but she still wore her combat boots underneath. "You look," Edward started, then paused. "You look like you own the place." "It feels heavy," Jessie admitted, coming to stand beside him. She didn't look at him. She looked out at the sanctuary. "Tomorrow they are going to say my name. My real name. Jessica Verethi, first of the blood." "It is a good name," Edward said. "It is a target," Jessie said. "Once it is spoken, Calyx will know. The remnants of the old regime will know. The quiet life is over, Edward." "The quiet life was boring anyway," Edward said. "I prefer a little noise." Jessie turned to him. In the starlight, her features were sharp and beautiful. "What will you do after tomorrow Rosa says you are free to go? You have the pass." "I do," Edward nodded. "I could go to the pleasure beaches of Zentari, drink cocktails, retire." "Will you?" Jessie asked. Her voice was small, vulnerable. Edward looked at her. He thought about Nova sleeping safely in a room full of vampire-singing plants. He thought about Mana's wisdom and Fanny's terrible toast. He thought about the warmth of Jessie's hand on his. "I have a rule," Edward said slowly. "I never fly with an empty hold. And I never leave my crew behind." Jessie let out a breath she had been holding. She reached out and took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. She didn't say anything, but the grip was iron strong. Below them in the plaza, the lights began to brighten slowly. The symbols of the gathered clans, dragon, vampire, catfolk, human, wolfkin, were being projected into the air, weaving together into a tapestry of unity. Far across the garden, on the highest terrace of the central spire, a lone figure stood watching the sky. It was Rosa. She stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the stars, as if she were waiting for a signal. "She is planning something," Edward murmured, watching the old woman. "She is an empress," Jessie said, a hint of pride in her voice. "She is planning everything." "Are you ready?" Edward asked. Jessie looked at the sunrise beginning to bleed into the artificial sky, turning the horizon a burning orange. "No," Jessie said. She squeezed his hand. "But I am not alone. So let's start." They stood there, hand in hand, as the Aurora Crown woke up for the day that would change the galaxy. The silence of the night was ending, and the music of the ceremony, the drums of the wolfkin, the chimes of the dragons began to beat a slow, steady rhythm in the distance. The stage was set. The players were ready. The curtain was about to rise. The morning sun of the Aurora Crown sanctuary did not rise. It bloomed. The artificial bioluminescence of the massive biosphere shifted from the deep indigo of night to a soft, pulsating gold, washing over the floating islands and the crystalline spire in the center. On the wayward ember, the mood was a chaotic blend of anxiety and frantic grooming. "I look like a penguin wrapped in tinfoil," Edward muttered, tugging at the collar of the formal tunic Rosa's attendants had delivered. It was a high-collared jacket of dark gray weave, simple but unmistakably expensive, with silver threading along the cuffs. "You look handsome, Dad," Nova said, spinning in a circle. She was wearing a dress made of a fabric that seemed to change color, with her movement blue, like the nebula, then pink, like a supernova. "Fanny fixed your hair. It is actually lying flat for once." "That involved more hair gel than I am comfortable with," Edward grumbled, checking his reflection in the polished metal of the airlock door. He looked tired, but the dark circles under his eyes had faded after 10 days of real sleep and clean air. He looked less like a desperate smuggler and more like a captain. The airlock hissed open, revealing the 3 Wolfkin sisters waiting on the docking pier. Edward stopped dead. They had shed the rags of Keros 4 and the borrowed flight suits of the journey. They were dressed in ceremonial robes of the wolfkin tradition, but modernized. Jessie stood in the center. She wore a deep crimson tunic over black trousers, belted with a sash of woven gold. Her shoulders were squared, her posture military, but the fabric softened her edges. She looked regal, terrifying, and breathtaking. Mana wore silver and blue, her hair braided with small crystals that caught the light. She looked ethereal, like a priestess of the void. Fanny, ever the mechanic, had managed to make her green formal wear look practical, with hidden pockets that Edward suspected were full of tools and snacks. "Stop staring, pilot," Jessie said, though her ears twitched with a hint of embarrassment. "Or I will trip on this sash and take you down with me." "I was not staring," Edward lied, walking down the ramp. "I was inspecting the crew. You clean up well." "We feel ridiculous," Fanny whispered loudly. "This fabric itches, and I am 90% sure I am wearing the pants backwards." "It is for the ceremony," Mana said, her voice calm. "We honor the House of Rosa." They walked together toward the central spire. The path was lined with honor guards, not soldiers with guns, but representatives of the species. A dragon bowed his massive scaled head as they passed. A vampire elder placed a hand over her heart. "Why are they looking at us like that?" Nova whispered, clutching Edward's hand. "Because we are guests of the lady," Edward said, though a prickle of unease ran down his spine. The respect felt too heavy, too specific. The great hall of the Aurora Crown was a masterpiece of architectural fusion. The ceiling was a dome of transparent bioglass, letting the light of the nebula filter in. The floor was a mosaic of 1,000 different stones, representing the planets of the sector. The hall was full. There were hundreds of delegates. Edward recognized faces from the newsfeeds, leaders of the trade guilds, matriarchs of the dragon clans, the High Council from Concord Hub. Even the catfolk admiral who had processed their arrest was there, looking surprisingly solemn. But there was no tension. Usually, a gathering like this would be thick with political maneuvering, whispered threats, and the scent of fear. Today, the air smelled of ozone and burning sage. It felt like a church, not a parliament. "Front row," an attendant whispered, guiding them to a set of seats near the raised dais. Edward sat feeling exposed. Jessie sat beside him, her leg bouncing nervously. "Something is wrong," Jessie murmured. "This is too big for a reaffirmation of a treaty. Look at the banners." Edward looked. Hanging from the high balconies were banners he didn't recognize. They weren't the flags of the Concord or the guilds. They were deep purple banners bearing a single sigil, a white wolf and a golden star intertwined. "The royal crest," Mana whispered, her face draining of color. "That is the crest of the Varethi dynasty. It has not been flown since the capital fell." Before Edward could ask what she meant, the heavy bronze gongs at the back of the hall resonated, a deep thrumming sound that vibrated in the chest. The hall went silent. 500 beings held their breath. Rosa walked onto the dais. She was not the grandmotherly gardener in the gray tunic anymore. She wore a robe of white light, woven from fiber optics and silk. On her head rested a simple circlet of unpolished iron. She carried no weapon, but her presence filled the cavernous room like a physical pressure. She was not just Rosa. She was the Empress, the Galactic Mother, the one who had stitched the galaxy back together after the Ember War. "Children of the stars," Rosa began. Her voice did not need amplification. It carried on the acoustics of the room, clear and bell-like. "We gather here today not to sign papers, but to remember scars." She looked out over the crowd. 20 years ago, the Ember War tore our reality apart. We used weapons we did not understand. We opened the Arc scars. We nearly consumed ourselves in greed and fire. We survived because we chose to stop fighting. We chose to build this crown as a promise. She paused, her eyes sweeping the front row, lingering on Edward and the sisters. But a promise is only words until it is tested. And in the shadows, there are still those who believe that power is the only truth. They believe that blood is a currency. They believe that life is a commodity. Edward felt Jessie stiffen beside him. I have lived in hiding, Rosa continued, her voice dropping to a sorrowful register. Not for my own safety, but to protect the last hope of my line. When the capital fell, my 3 granddaughters were taken. They were not killed. They were stolen, hidden away, bred and broken to be used as keys. Keys to unlock the weapon caches of the Ark that I sealed away. A murmur ran through the crowd. I searched for them, Rosa said. For 15 years I searched. But the galaxy is vast and the shadows are deep. She stepped forward to the edge of the dais. She looked directly at Jessie, Mana, and Fanny. But the stars have a way of correcting their course, Rosa said softly. The lost have been found. She raised her hand. Jessica Varethi, Manara Varethi, Fanya Varethi, stand. The silence in the hall was absolute. Jessie didn't move. She looked frozen, struck by a stun baton. Jessie, Edward whispered, nudging her gently. Stand up. Slowly, shakily, the 3 sisters stood. Behold, Rosa announced, her voice ringing with pride and grief. The heirs of the Aurora, the daughters of the blood, the ones who were sold in a cage on Keros 4 for 3,000 credits. The crowd erupted. It wasn't applause. It was a gasp of collective shock, followed by a low rumble of outrage. Jessie looked like she was going to be sick. She stared at Rosa, her eyes wide with betrayal and confusion. No, Jessie whispered. I am a soldier. I am a guard. I am not. Rosa stepped down from the dais. She walked through the gap in the security detail, coming to stand directly in front of them. The cameras of 100 worlds were focused on this moment. You are a warrior, yes, Rosa said gently, reaching out to cup Jessie's face. But you were born to protect more than just yourself. You were born to lead. I was in a cage, Jessie choked out, tears brimming in her amber eyes. I wore a collar. They sold me. And that is why you will be a great queen, Rosa said firmly. Because you know what it feels like to be small. A ruler who has never known chains cannot understand the value of freedom. Mana was trembling, tears streaming silently down her silver fur. She understood. She had always felt the connection to the Ark, the burden of the bloodline. Fanny looked panic-stricken. She looked at Nova, then at Edward. Does this mean I cannot fix toasters anymore? She squeaked. A ripple of laughter broke the tension in the room. Rosa smiled, a genuine warm smile. It means you can fix whatever you want, little one, including the galaxy. Rosa turned to the crowd, keeping her hand on Jessie's shoulder. But they are not here today because of destiny. They are here because of a choice made by a man who had every reason to walk away. She turned her gaze to Edward. Captain Edward, Rosa said. Stand. Edward stood. His knees felt like water. He wanted to crawl under the chair. He was a smuggler. He was a guy who owed money on his docking fees. He didn't belong here. Tell them, Rosa said to the crowd. Tell them about the Exodus 7. Edward swallowed. He looked at the faces watching him, dragons, vampires, royalty. Then he looked at Nova. She was looking up at him like he was the biggest star in the sky. It was 20 years ago, Rosa said, telling the story for him. A refugee ship, 3,000 souls, engines dead, falling into a gravity well. The military had ordered a retreat, but one courier ship turned back. Edward closed his eyes. He could still feel the vibration of the yoke in his hands from that day, the screaming of the metal. He attached a tow line, Rosa's voice was fierce. A single foolish line, and he pulled. He burned his engines until they fused. He held us against the dark, and when his ship failed, he held us with something else. She looked at Edward. He is an anchor, a rare human spirit capable of stabilizing the chaotic energy of the universe. He held the Exodus 7 together with his will alone, until the rescue fleet arrived. And then he vanished. She stepped closer to Edward. I have watched you, Edward. I watched you leave 3 nutrient bars on every landing pad, an offering to the ghosts of the people you thought you couldn't save. I watched you raise a daughter on a freighter. I watched you risk everything to save 3 strangers on Keros 4. I didn't know who they were, Edward whispered. I just couldn't leave them. Exactly, Rosa said. You didn't save them because they were princesses. You saved them because they were people. That is the only nobility that matters. She signaled to an attendant who brought forward a small velvet cushion. On it lay a badge. It was simple, a silver wing encompassing a golden star. The Conquered Council and the Aurora Throne have agreed, Rosa announced. We cannot give you back the years you spent running, but we can give you a future. She pinned the badge onto Edward's jacket. We grant you the title of Free Passage Captain. By the laws of the Ember Concordat, your ship is sovereign soil. You pay no tax, you answer to no border guard. You are the designated guardian of the displaced. Where there are chains, you have the authority to break them. Where there are walls, you have the right to cross them. Edward touched the badge. It was cold solid. Free passage, he murmured. Does it come with a fuel card? Unlimited refueling at any conquered port, Rosa winked. Sold, Edward said, and the crowd laughed again, this time with warmth and applause. But the moment of triumph was cut short. The lights in the hall flickered. The golden bioluminescence turned a sickly, bruised purple. A massive holographic projection tore into the air above the dais, static distortion, screaming through the speakers. It was Calyx. He looked worse than when they had last seen him. Half his face was scarred from the backlash of the arc device, and he was sitting in the gloom of a bridge on a rogue warship. So touching, Calyx sneered, his voice distorted, but booming. The grandmother finds her lost puppies. The pilot gets a medal, and the galaxy claps. Security drones instantly mobilized, but Rosa held up a hand. Let him speak. Let everyone see the face of the past. You think this is over, Rosa, Calyx hissed. You think putting a crown on a girl who spent her life in a cage makes her an empress? The arc is not done with you. The scars are opening. I have the coordinates of the primordial rifts. If I cannot have the keys, I will break the lock. You are alone, Calyx. Jessie stepped forward. Her voice wasn't shaking anymore. She shouted at the hologram, her warrior's cadence returning. Look around you. The dragon clans are here. The vampires are here. You have no army. You have no leverage. You are just a thief, hiding in the dark. I have the truth, Calyx roared. That peace is a lie, that the strong should eat the weak. Suddenly, the dragon matriarch in the front row stood up. She was 20 feet tall, her scales shimmering like diamonds. She looked at the hologram with infinite disdain. Calyx of the Obsidian, she rumbled, her voice shaking the glass dome. You speak for no clan. You are nameless. Your fire is cold. Then the vampire lord stood. You are bloodless to us. Then the catfolk admiral. You are without harbor. One by one, the representatives stood. They didn't attack. They simply denied him. They rejected his philosophy. You see, Rosa said calmly, you are fighting a war that ended 20 years ago. Go, Calyx. Run to your rifts. You will find nothing there but your own shadow. Calyx snarled, furious at his impotence. This is not over, I will. The transmission cut. Rosa had signaled the tech crews. The hologram vanished, and the golden light returned. It is over for today, Rosa said firmly. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow we have a free passage captain, and 3 heirs to deal with him. The ceremony ended, not with a march, but with a feast. Tables appeared laden with food from 100 worlds. Edward found himself the center of attention, shaking hands with admirals and bowing to duchesses. He hated every second of it, but he endured it for Nova, who was currently explaining her drawing of a chef dragon to the actual dragon matriarch, who seemed delighted. Late that night, when the crowds had dispersed and the station had quieted to a low hum, Edward escaped. He went to the high balcony, overlooking the docking spires. The Wayward Ember was down there looking small and battered next to the sleek diplomatic cruisers. But to Edward, she looked beautiful. "You are hiding," a voice said behind him. It was Jessie. She had changed out of the ceremonial robes back into her flight suit, though she still wore the sash of gold around her waist. "I am observing," Edward corrected, leaning on the railing. "There is a difference." Jessie came to stand beside him. She smelled of expensive perfume and gun oil, a combination Edward found alarmingly attractive. "So," Jessie said, looking out at the stars, "I am a princess." "Apparently," Edward said. "Does that mean I have to bow?" "If you bow, I will punch you," Jessie said immediately. "Good. My back is killing me anyway." They stood in silence for a moment. "Rosa wants us to stay," Jessie said. Her voice was quiet. "She wants Mana to study the Ark. She wants Fanny to modernize the station's grid. And she wants me to learn how to rule." "You should," Edward said, keeping his voice steady, though his chest felt tight. "You would be good at it. You care about people. That is half the job." "And you," Jessie asked. "You have the free passage. You can go anywhere." "I have a delivery to make," Edward said, looking at his boots. "I picked up a cargo of rare spices on the way in. Gotta pay the bills." "You have unlimited fuel and no taxes, Edward," Jessie pointed out. "You do not have bills anymore." "Old habits," Edward shrugged. Jessie turned to him. She looked terrified, more terrified than when she faced the dragon. "A queen needs advisors," she said, stumbling over the words. "A military strategist, a logistics expert, a personal transport pilot." "Are you offering me a job?" Edward smiled slightly. "I am asking if—" Jessie took a deep breath. She looked him in the eye, her amber gaze piercing. "I am asking if a royal heir is allowed to date a scruffy caffeine-addicted human pilot with a broken-down ship." Edward blinked. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His brain, usually so good at calculating vectors and escape routes, had stalled. Suddenly, the balcony door slid open with a whoosh. "She is asking you out, Dad," Nova yelled, jumping out from behind a potted plant. She was holding a half-eaten skewer of grilled meat. "Just say yes, by the stars, you are so slow." "Nova." Edward turned his face, flushing red. "Were you eavesdropping?" "Fanny and Mana are listening too," Nova pointed at the door. Fanny's head popped out. "We have a betting pool. Mana said he would faint. I said he would stutter." "Pay up, Mana." Mana sighed from the hallway. The emotional resonance was ambiguous. Edward looked back at Jessie. She was laughing. It was a full, deep laugh that shook her shoulders. "Well," Jessie asked, grinning, "the kid approves, but I have conditions." "Conditions?" Edward raised an eyebrow. 1. No more nutrient bars for dinner. Jessie counted on her fingers. 2. I get to fly the ship during combat. 3. You have to teach me how to brew that terrible coffee you drink. Edward pretended to think about it. He looked at Nova, who was giving him a double thumbs up. He looked at the Wayward Ember. He looked at Jessie, the wolf warrior, who had fought her way out of a cage and into his life. "I can agree to terms 1 and 3, Edward said. "But nobody touches my flight stick during combat. That is non-negotiable." Jessie stepped closer, closing the distance between them. She reached out and adjusted his collar, her claws grazing his neck gently. "We will negotiate," she whispered, and then she kissed him. It was brief, fierce, and tasted of the sweet wine from the feast. When she pulled back, Edward looked dazed. "Deal," he managed to say. 2 weeks later, the Wayward Ember was prepped for launch. The cargo hold wasn't empty. It was full of supplies for a relief mission to a colony on the Outer Rim, medical kits, water purifiers, and seed banks provided by the Aurora Crown. Mana and Fanny stood at the bottom of the ramp. "I will miss the vibration," Mana said, hugging Edward. But the library here, Edward, it sings. I have so much to learn. Don't blow up the station, Edward told her. I make no promises. Mana smiled serenely. Fanny hugged Nova so hard, she lifted the girl off the ground. Do not forget to practice your welding. I put a beginner's torch in your bag. I won't, Nova promised. I will send you drawings. You better, Fanny said, wiping her eyes with a greasy rag. Go on. Get out of here before I cry and rust my implants. Edward walked up the ramp. Nova followed. In the cockpit, Edward settled into the pilot's seat. He ran the pre-flight check. Thrusters green, shields green. Cargo secure. Co-pilot, Edward called out. Status. Jessie swiveled around in the co-pilot seat. She was wearing a new flight suit, black, with the royal crest stitched small on the shoulder. She looked right at home. Systems nominal captain, Jessie said. Route plotted to the rim. We have clear skies. Rosa is okay with you leaving, Edward asked for the 10th time. Rosa said that a queen who stays in the palace forgets the people, Jessie quoted. She said I need to see the galaxy, and she said she needs someone to keep an eye on her favorite anchor. She is a meddling old woman, Edward grumbled affectionately. She is the Empress, Jessie grinned. Launch, Edward confirmed. The wayward ember detached from the spire. The engines flared blue, powerful and steady. As they pulled away from the Aurora Crown, Edward looked at the rear monitor. The station was a shining ring of hope in the darkness. He thought about the 3 nutrient bars he had left on the ramp at Keros 4. He had traded 3 bars of tasteless protein for this, for a family, for a purpose, for a future. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh nutrient bar. He placed it on the dashboard. For the ghosts, Jessie asked softly. Edward shook his head. He peeled the wrapper open and took a bite. It tasted like cardboard and victory. No, Edward said. For the road, he pushed the throttle forward. Punch it, Nova yelled from the back. The stars stretched into infinite lines of light, and the wayward ember jumped into the void, not running away from anything, but flying toward everything. The end.